Welcome to everybody, and welcome to the Wednesday Nexa Wednesday. Sorry, number 133. Today we have the pleasure to have David Schmude presenting his work on preservations of artistic works in the net art. David will show us what are the issues about preservation of this form of digital art, and sharing with us, discussing with us current best practices and future technologies. David is a very particular person, is a very particular professional because he's a half researcher and a half computational artist. Sorry, I have okay. Thanks, Giovanni, for muting the people who have the mic open. I was saying that David has a profile that is very rare. He's half researcher and half computational artist, and he has installed his artistic works in many museums in the world. I'm reading in his presentation in New York City, in Chicago, in Moscow, and in LA, Los Angeles, just to mention a few of them. So we are very honored to have David with us tonight. And before I leave the stage to him, of these meetings. The meeting is recorded, and so we can be seen also after this tonight, and it is also in parallel going on streaming in YouTube. So the people who are here in this room are people that connect to potentially interact with David after his presentation. Then we have a number of people who is viewing from the YouTube channel of the Nexa Center. As all Wednesdays, all Nexa Wednesdays, the meeting has consists of 1 hour presentation from the guest and 1 hour discussion. Then we are a little bit flexible, but we try to stick to this template. As I said, the meeting is recorded, so being in this virtual room means that you agree to be recorded, and then that your voice, and in case you show your face is then later on YouTube. And I also would like to say that usually we make around, when these meetings are held in presence, we make a round of presentations. I see that the room is quickly filling, so at the moment we are 15 people. So as we did for previous Wednesday meetings held virtually, with this number of people is a bit more complex to have in a short time a round of presentations. So we will skip, unfortunately, this moment. I think I spoke too much. I already stolen 5 minutes from David. So David, you know that you can go at least 5 minutes beyond the time in your presentation. And so thank you in advance for the talk. And I last thing, I ask everybody to mute the microphone and to switch off the cameras during David's presentation. We can switch on again later on. So please, David, the floor is yours.
Well, hello. So my name is David Schmude. Yes, I will be doing today's presentation in English from Turin, Italy. I split my time between Turin and Berlin. I am American, but I am working on my Italian. Unfortunately, it's probably not good enough for any sort of public discourse, but I appreciate the opportunity to share some of these thoughts and ideas in English. This is a great opportunity, hopefully, to also have afterwards a very nice discussion. So I'm going to share my screen first, bring up my slides here. And I guess if I'm cutting out or you can't see my slides or there's some technical problem, if you could unmute or somehow, let me know, that would be great. So as Antonio already sort of mentioned, today we'll be talking a little bit about software preservation. And this will go into some software engineering concepts. And obviously, considering that this is the Nexa Institute, I will be talking a little bit about networking, but that part will be a little less technical than my discussion on programming. So a little bit more about me just before we start out. My background, my bachelor's was in computer science. And then I earned a master's in music, specifically music technology. And I've done a lot of creative work in time-based media. As the generous introduction implied, I have exhibited in various places around the world. And I've been giving talks on time-based media as well. And of course, the presentation and preservation of time-based media, which includes cinema, but it also includes interactive media, basically any media happening in time. It could also include performance art. And currently, I work at a company called Yorba, and we are focused on solving the problem of identity as an individual on the internet, how you control your identity, having some sort of safety and some sort of ability to manage your identity are the sort of underpinnings that we're preeminently concerned with. Okay, so we need to start out by getting on the same page on some terminology. So the first part is all foundations, and the trickiest word is the first word we'll talk about, which is art. I'm going to probably give too simple of a definition for art, but it's one that I found pretty useful, and it's the one that I'll be using throughout this presentation. So what we have here in the photograph is a hammer and a spade or a shovel, and they're of course quite ornate. I took this photograph at the Vatican in Rome, and this is the same, well, maybe not the same building, but you walk around the Vatican, you see the masterpieces of great hands like Raphael and Michelangelo, and this is enshrined, these two objects are enshrined in these same buildings as those great artists. And what we have is two objects that are, of course, jewel encrusted, and I think that they fit the definition of art, certainly because they've been expanded upon so that they are even less functional, right? So art is not necessarily primarily concerned about its function. And so a hammer is just a hammer, and it's engineered as a hammer until we add something to it. Maybe we carve the handle, or we add these jewels or whatever, and then the hammer becomes an aesthetic object, and it might even become less functional. And so my definition of art throughout this talk will be any entity, so object or thing, maybe digital entity, in which art is the primary function. It seems like a recursive definition. I'm defining art by using the word art, but that seems to me kind of perfect for this definition. Any entity where art is its primary function, so this hammer and the shovel, they weren't designed primarily to be hammers and shovels, or else they wouldn't look like this, right? So they can be art objects. So anything that goes beyond the engineering of the object. And so there are many categories of aesthetic objects, though, that are on the other side of, or aesthetic entities that are on the other side of the practical spectrum that aren't just engineered, say like advertising. There are plenty of advertising campaigns and advertising materials and advertising objects, but it's a useful distinction from art, the fact that advertising has a primary function of selling something. Design or user experience, it's very creative, but it has a primary function of driving towards an outcome. Video games have incredibly creative components, but the primary function of any sort of game, even a chess game, is to complete the game or win at the game. Games without goals, video games without goals might qualify for art, but I'm making a distinction that games are different than art because they have these qualities. So with that out of the way, the next thing I want to, the next term I want to define is craft. Craft is also going to be an important part of this discussion as we talk about preservation, because of course, preservation and handiwork are two things that go together when we talk about conventional art objects like sculptures and paintings. If you modify the object too much, of course, you're imbuing your own handiwork on the original artist's handiwork, and you're potentially obfuscating the craft of the original artist. So it's an important concept in preservation. But software makes defining craft much more difficult. Software didn't start this problem, but it is the current apex of this conceptual issue. I'll look back at the 20th century here and look at a craftsmanship or craftspersonship in the metaphysical sense when I talk about cinema, for example. So cinema in the 1890s, when it was sort of discovered, and then moving into the early 20th century, there was quite a bit of thinking behind the movie industry that saw the director as a person that managed craftspeople, that managed artisans, that managed the creative people on the set. So the people actually creating the costumes, the people actually shooting or managing the camera. Those sorts of people, these very creative individuals, needed to be coordinated together, and it was the job of the director to manage those people. But in the mid-century, a little bit after the 1950s, 1960s, we saw the emergence of this auteur theory that proposed that directors of films were people who actually were artists themselves. And so the director was the artist. But the director was never actually, of course, getting their hands dirty. I mean, some of them did operate cameras, but the film is a result of a huge number of people. So they are actually doing most of their work as an artist, as a metaphysical work. And so the same can be said of software, that it is a sort of a metaphysical endeavor. Obviously it is, because of course we are moving electrons around in a machine. And the difference is that instead of the management of people, it is the management of software processes that the creative artist is undergoing in their enterprise of creating an art piece. So of course, there are many programmers that are creating or managing software processes for specific goals, like financial transactions, like social media campaigns. But there are also within that set of programmers, a subset of programmers who are just artists that are arranging these software processes without an explicit goal other than for it to be art. So their processes, these artists, their processes on the network happens where it's diagrammed in this art piece from 1997, where it points to exactly where art is, quote unquote, happening in a network-based environment. It is happening between the machines. So it is completely metaphysical. So how do you archive something that is so, or preserve something that is so completely metaphysical, and what are the properties that are going to concern us the most? To think about this, it might help to talk about where this conception of space arises from. We call this space, at least in the 90s, we called this space cyberspace. And the term cyberspace presumptively is a play off of this earlier word, cybernetics, which was based on this ancient Greek word that is in regards to steering or piloting sort of a vessel. And how it was used when Norbert Wiener actually coined the term was the governance of the components of a system. And oftentimes the governance of these processes in a system were indeed done without any human intervention. So these were self-governing systems, and for example, they could be used in military applications, which is one of the first sources of funding for cybernetic research in the mid 20th century. And basically, one of the propositions here is, for example, if you have an airplane that you're trying to shoot down with a cannon, the cannon might miss, but if it could measure how inaccurate it was and measure the other environmental variables like wind speed and the speed of the plane, etc., then it could adjust without any human intervention and take another shot at the plane. And indeed, if that also missed, it could again fine-tune it until it eventually hit the plane. And none of that feedback loop, that process, of course, required any human intervention. So when the artists, of course, were thinking about this, they were thinking about the process thinking about process control and regulation as an art practice. And so in these art pieces, you might have just machine-to-machine communication, or you might have human input as part of the communication. One of the first art shows that investigated this was called Cybernetic Serendipity in 1968. This is a shot from this is a shot of one of the pieces from the exhibition. And Pask's work here, basically this thing would rotate and move around, and there were, I guess, female objects and male objects essentially, and they would shine lights at one another, and some of them had mirrors on them, and if the mirror reflected back, then they would have some sort of dance. And of course, this is all a feedback loop and a machine communication as an art piece that had no human intervention. The show itself was organized into 3 sections: computer-generated work, which may or may not be cybernetic in its nature, cybernetic devices like robots and painting machines, and then this third one that I want to pay particular attention to, which are machines demonstrating the use of computers in the history of cybernetics. So we'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that third one in a little bit. The other show that I want to highlight here is the immaterial put on in Paris a couple of decades later. And the material had these cybernetic concepts as part of its underpinning as well. Reading the part in bold here, the immaterial is matter. The immaterial is matter subjected to interaction and conceptual processes. And so, what this person is asserting is that although the show was called The Immaterial, it of course had many material components to it that people would interact with, would somehow interact with not only physically, but as part of sort of a conceptual or mind game with, I guess, a game of consciousness with maybe an inanimate object, and certain outcomes would result. So if you're going to preserve a show like The Immaterial, this actually does become difficult because, of course, what we're pointing at are processes. What we are pointing at are interactions between people and objects. And the art is happening not in the person or in the object, but it's happening in the interplay. So preserving something like that is quite tricky. This was their approach. A quick overview of these points. One of the things that they started out with is they didn't actually have a catalog of works, which most major exhibitions do. Instead, they had these unbound cards, sort of like they were not bound in a book. They were loose, so they could be looked at in any order or studied in any order. There are 61 of these cards in total for every piece in the exhibition. And also, the official publication included a making of retrospective of the exhibition. It also included 26 sort of thinkers in France and perhaps around the world exchanging electronic messages in 1985 on 50 prompts set by the curator. And this is also published officially. And I'd like to note that one thing is many of these people had never exchanged an electronic message before. So the novelty of that communication medium could be seen, could be read in the discussion itself. And the other thing that I'd like to note is that that the curator is as part of their effort for the show to document the show. They were prompting, or they were creating dialogues that were part of the documentation. A sociologist also did a study based on observations and based on data collected from visitors through interviews. There was also a survey as an art piece in the exhibition where a person would communicate or work with a terminal, and results would be live fed, projected on the wall behind them. And there was an intention to have a magnetic card strip, sort of like a credit card before we had the chips in them. So you could swipe the strip, and at every zone you go through, because these zones, which are locations for art experiences, were not in any particular order, and there was no guidance on how you should actually approach this thing. Kind of like the internet itself, there was very few signposts, if any. And so the strip would then, if you checked in at every zone, then you would, at the end of your visit, receive a printout of your path through the exhibit. And based on these assertions, or based on these methods, Anthony Hudek observed that this exhibition had an auto-archiving impulse. It could be, quote, considered a self-remembering exhibition. But another person who was there at the time also had this reflection 10 years ago when talking about this sort of landmark exhibition. And he said, I will read this quote in full. He said, "The documentation of this exhibition is now hard to come by. And even though I have held on to the catalogs and related materials from the press kit for the review I wrote at the time in 1985, it still seems difficult to bring into focus what I saw then." And with both Cybernetic Serendipity and the Immaterial, both of these two exhibitions, one of the problems that plagues them is the original art objects are very difficult to reproduce. It's very difficult. It's, of course, not like bringing a Rodin or Picasso into an exhibition and seeing the originals. Most of these works aren't reproduced. They were produced only once. And so all we have is documentation, and this documentation may not be enough. But in the 60s, documentation was part of the processes that these people are clearly exploring. And it came to the fore in these movements like system aesthetics and conceptual art. System aesthetics, this term coined by Jack Burnham, he noted that the idea of processes takes precedence over the end results. Okay, so the process itself is more important than the results. And as I say the word process, think about this, please, as a computer process, as much as like a process of making something with your hands. So the idea of process takes precedence over the end results. We also see it with Sol LeWitt, a famous conceptual artist, talking about the idea is as important as the art object. The art object need not even be made. There's also efforts to systematize and processize aesthetics. This is a diagram from Abraham Malais's work, Cybernetics and the Work of Art. And you can see there's all these, in this time, there's all these diagrams as they are trying to turn, even many of these people had not used computers, they're trying to turn aesthetics and art and design, they're trying to turn these things into processes because many of them are automatable. And of course, if they're automatable, they're probably also computable. So personally, myself, I find documentation just as documentation alone, not as satisfying as seeing art pieces. But this is part of the legacy of the art and the thinking from the 60s and 70s. And the processes themselves can be interesting, and they can lead to reproducible artworks. A lot of, for example, Sol LeWitt, he's a conceptual artist, an American conceptual artist. A lot of his processes are so simple or so localized within the craft of drawing that they're pretty easy to reproduce, actually. But the problem is that the processes of any greater complexity are processes of systems and systems integrations, okay? And of course, we see that all over the network space. We see integrated systems. And part of our issues as network engineers is how to get unrelated processes to integrate and talk to each other. But also, if we want to reproduce that process 15 years from now, can we? Okay, most, of course, network processes are not built for that sort of longevity. And so, so the documentation of these, I divide them into local processes is pretty simple and pretty easy to reproduce results with, but these like larger system processes, even if it's well documented, it's very difficult for any complex process to be reproduced years later. So therefore, because so many of these art artifacts from the period were actually like complex systems, they were never reproduced. So that's part one. Now, part two, I want to take a survey now of contemporary networked art. I could say networked art since like the 90s. So contemporary is maybe a strong word. But yeah, networked art since the 90s and take a survey of the preservation techniques used to keep these things alive and in a way so we can maybe experience them again. I'm going to look at 4 techniques laid out by the preservationists at Rhizome, which I'll talk about in one moment. But the 4 techniques that I'll be looking at are documentation, reconstructions, mise en scene, and reenactment. And we'll get into the details of what that means as we go along. And one of the highlights that I want to, that was kind of an accidental outcome of putting together this talk, was I want to highlight how these artworks reflect the zeitgeist of their era, how these artworks actually capture important moments in time of, in this case, network culture, of internet culture. We'll see the transition to the corporate web, we'll see the centralization of the web, and we'll see the emergence of activism on the web as these existential fears, concerns, as these processes that artists are trying to work out how they live in this new environment. The terms that I used, documentation, reconstruction, mise en scene, and reenactment, come from the preservationists, as I said, from Rhizome. And the works, most of the works I'll look at today, to keep it simple, there are several great organizations that are working towards preservation of art online and are grappling with these questions. But to keep it simple, I'm going to focus on the work at Rhizome and take a critical examination of their work, and also even narrower, more narrow, they published this book, The Art Happens Here, the Net Art Anthology, and had an accompanying exhibition at the New Museum in New York City. And it's a collection of 100 pieces that they say is their curatorial and presentation testing ground, exploring the best practices for making historic works available at scale. And the other organization I'll be mentioning a couple times, which I'm sure that most of the people here are familiar with, is the Internet Archive. And they're self-described as a digital library of internet sites, as archiving a digital library of internet sites and other cultural artifacts. Okay. So they're concerned about the preservation of the internet at large. These 2 organizations have very different processes for preservation, which we may not have time to get into before we wrap this up. So when I was making this presentation too, I had to also, of course, grab some screenshots and find some links and do some research. And of course, this is net art. This is art born on the internet. And of course, I saw a lot of this. So as part of this talk, I've also I'll have it launched next week. I bought the domain name. I have it pointing to a server called netart.today, which just catalogs all the link rot for net art, all the disappearing net art. I ran into screens like this quite a bit. I would link, there would be a hot link from one site to another site, and boom, I'd get a dead link. This particular one is toywar.com, which we'll talk about in a second. So first thing we'll talk about, since we've already kind of discussed documentation in terms of art, we'll talk about that as a preservation strategy for network art. And these descriptions come from the Net Art Anthology. These are their preservation techniques. So they're talking about this, they call this the artwork is presented primarily in the form of depictive or descriptive documentation. This first piece, though, is not part of the anthology. I thought it was important to also present this piece. It's a landmark. They're a landmark performance art group on the internet from the 90s. And I thought it was important enough to include it, even though it's not part of the anthology. So what you're looking at is a screen capture from their retrospective site. If you look on the upper left corner of the screen capture, it says the corporation history. Okay, so eToy was this artist group founded in Switzerland in 1994, and they were sort of this pseudo. They were like corporation as art. So they incorporated, they sold stocks, they traveled around in shipping containers they called tanks as if they were commodities. And this is how they present their overall, their history of work from 1994 to like 2013. The particular piece I want to focus on is this piece called Toy War. And Toy War was a piece in 1999. On the right, you see how it's preserved as documentation. And you look at it and it doesn't, the webpage isn't that meaningful. Like the documentation isn't necessarily that meaningful unless you're familiar with the story of Toy War. Basically, I can give the story really quick. eToy was the performance art group in Switzerland, founded in 1994. eToys, plural.com, was the largest e-commerce toy retailer before the dot-com bubble in the United States in 1999, 2000. So eToy.com were a bunch of artists. eToys.com was a venture capital funded initiative to sell toys on the internet. And eToys.com felt that eToy.com was, of course, many people would mistype the URL and go to the performance art piece instead of the domain where you can buy toys. They're confused by the content. There were some bad words on the web pages, just basically stuff that they didn't want associated with their brand. So they took the performance art group to court. And in fact, for a while, it looks like they looked like they might lose the case. And toywar.com was the centerpiece of this social activism sort of campaign online to galvanize support on the internet against eToys. And it worked. eToys was already a publicly traded company, and they lost a massive amount of money in a public relations fiasco around this. And so that's why toywar.com claims that it is the most expensive performance in art history because of this incredible loss of capital by eToys. When eToys finally dropped the suit against the artists, the artists issued a press release that claimed total victory for the eToy Corporation and the internet community, which proved that the net is not yet in the hands of the e-commerce giants. And so this really reflects the anxiety of the increasing corporatization of the internet from something that was sort of an idealistic, brave new world, transitioning into a corporatized domain space, that they felt like that they were on the forefront of this cultural battleground. eToy also participated in many of the trolling and many of the trolling tactics and many of the hyperbolic statements that you can even see in this press release. Hyperbolic statements about total victory, and the language that they used was very much the language that we see today on social media. So that's documentation. This is what toywar.com looks like today. You can't go to the site. I mean, it doesn't exist. So it's just documented. If you look at the site on the Internet Archive, for example, most of it doesn't work. Okay, so you used to be able to buy shares as part of the resistance and all this, and that's all gone. So what's left is documentation. The second strategy is reconstruction. So these are inactive artworks where the original parts have been lost, that were originally distributed across several physical or virtual locations, and that are preserved in an incomplete or an unusable state. And so this is a nod to the fact that, of course, many of these art pieces that are net art pieces don't just live on one server in one place, and oftentimes they are much broader than that. So to demonstrate that, we're going to look at this piece called Air World. I'm going to risk, let's see if this will work. I'm going to risk going to the actual reserved site. Looks like it might actually be working. Look at that. So the site isn't online anymore. This is part of the reconstruction of the site. And so when you go to the net artwork in Rhizome's website, this is what you're presented with. Obviously a virtual machine, a Macintosh that boots into, it looks like Internet Explorer 4.5. I want you to pay particular attention to this URL here, archive.rhizome.org/anthology/airworld/disney.co.uk/index.html. So this was originally Disney's website in August of 2000. Okay, so this is Disney's website. Okay. This was what it looked like, disney.co.uk. This is what it looked like in August of 2000. So they reconstructed the Disney site because the art piece, in case you missed it, is this banner ad. So disney.co.uk had a space for banners, for advertisement. And these artists were able to, and I'll go into detail in a little bit, these artists were able to occupy the space, and you go into the space, you click through, and you get to the art site. This is, Airworld is not a corporation, it is a work of art, and you can interact with the work of art, and one of the things to note is that these words are generated from the sites that they advertise. So you can take a look at that yourself if you're curious to know more about this piece. But I'll get back to the presentation here. So what this advertisement entails is what they call a mise en scene. So the reconstruction is getting this site that had parts that were in incomplete state, rebuilding it, and then a mise en scene, which was then capturing the disney.co.uk page from the Internet Archive, and then applying this advertisement to give someone the sense of what it was like to engage in the piece in 1999 or 2000. So these advertisements were definitely part of the art piece. They were actually donated, or given, I should say given, 1 million banner ads for 1 month by DoubleClick.com. DoubleClick is the agency, or sorry, the technology that Google eventually bought that turned Google into an advertising powerhouse. They engaged in this art practice, and they basically procured ads on a certain set of domains, like disney.co.uk and several other corporations, and then they those domains would then, or those ads would then point back to the servers for Airworld, and the jargon that you saw, the sort of the video that was starting to play, and the jargon, those were all generated by taking text or word snippets from the corporate hosts. So basically, they are remixing the corporate web pages to create a new corporate web page. And they were taking those pictures and videos also from corporate websites to create a very generic corporation called Airworld. And one of the observers at the time opined, any reader opined by one of the observers at the time opined, gave his opinion, I should say, of this art piece by quoting the art piece itself. So this language is from Airworld. It read this: any reader should be advised that factors such as development of new capital, funding, competition, lack of other factors may materially affect in an adverse manner actual results of operations. And the observer opined, has this been written by a good corporate lawyer or a bad text generating program? So most of the language on this site was this corporate jargon that was generated by the machines from the sites that they bought ads on. And again, this is a response to this emerging ubiquitous commercial internet. Now, this reconstruction of mise en scene is really nice because, of course, you can interact with the project, but it's not without its issues. For example, here's a Twitter art critic suggesting that to Rhizome, the people who are hosting it, suggesting that he doesn't remember Disney as the launch page, and he tells him to fix it. But of course, the intention was not that Disney was the launch page. The intention was to give a sense of what it was like at that time. And then Joe, this Twitter art critic, then goes on to sort of correct himself. He understands that it's an ad, but the point is presenting something in this way can be very confusing. Even though it's quite clever, it can be very confusing to those people who engage. Piece by Raphael Rosendahl. And the thing about Rosendal's work is that he purports that the domain is part of the artwork, and so you actually need to if you want to preserve the artwork, you have to preserve the domain, and that's one of the ways that he also sells his work. People or collectors, in this case, Mark Rossman, collectors buy these artworks with the domain. They buy the domain as part of the collection. And so the question is, if you're reconstructing something like this, how do you accurately do it without needing to fully reconstruct the domain name service, the DNS service, right? And finally, I want to take a look at this other technique that they raise here, which is reenactment. Artworks relying on a set of infrastructure and cultural conventions that cannot be meaningfully reproduced via technical means without compromising the artistic integrity.